before, you probably know that we record all of these and we post them to our website, usually day of if we can, if not next day, so that you can go back and rewatch if you'd like, or share with colleagues, what have you. Before I turn it over to Reed, also want to remind everyone, please feel free to ask questions as we go through the content. We'll leave some time at the end to go over questions after Reed's finished presenting. But, please feel free to drop a question in the chat window if you have something. We'd be happy to field any questions during the presentation. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to New Signature Chief Technology Officer Reed Wiedower. Thanks, Reed.
Thanks, Ryan. So today we're going to be talking about empowering enterprise mobility, which is a fancy way of talking about mobile devices and bring your own device and choose your own device and just the world that we live in today that's relatively new from a technology perspective. I've been having these conversations with customers over the past several years, and this presentation is really designed to help get you going down that road of being able to implement a true bring your own device or choose your own device strategy driven by your business needs, and something that you can wrap your hands around and understand what problems and challenges you're trying to solve with this strategy. A lot of customers that I talk to say, well, we have to do this because people want it, or we're never going to do this because it's always going to be insecure. And both of those approaches are a little bit immature from a technology perspective, because you want to make sure that the strategy you choose is one that's empowering your individuals to do more work. But you also want to make sure that people stay safe and secure through the process. You don't want people abusing the policy in a way that makes your risk go up. So we'll cover all of that. I encourage you to ask questions throughout, and we'll certainly try to get to some of them at the end if we have enough time. So I think it's important to level set with the current state of mobility at organizations. And I think this is important because when I talk to customers, they tend to fall into one of two camps. One camp says, of course, everyone's already using mobile devices. Everyone has a smartphone. Everyone's using tablets. That's just the default. And at the other end of that spectrum are individuals that say, you know what, this seems like a lot of hullabaloo about nothing. We still give out phones to individuals. We still manage all of the devices. Maybe we don't even let people check their email outside of work unless they're on an approved device, and so forth. And so there's a large spectrum of different opinions for how widespread mobility is. I think when you look at it, and both the Corporate Executive Board and Forrester did a number of surveys, and what they found was that a huge number of employees already use personal devices for work purposes. So even if your corporate policy is to say you can only use a work-specified device to check your email or access corporate documents, employees are just getting around that. And they're using a variety of different mechanisms to do so, but by and large, the vast majority of employees are using personal devices today. Now, that might not be malicious in any way, and it might be something as simple as saying, I have an iPhone or an Android phone or a new Surface, and I'm using that to check my email. But those devices might not be approved devices. So when you think about it, the real thrust there is that people want to be able to get access to their work environment on their personal device. They want to be able to go to Best Buy and pick up a shiny new tablet and within minutes be able to be sending and receiving work email on it. If you're not enabling that, or you're not enabling it more easily, people are going to find ways around it. When you think about moving forward from today into the future, in the next 5 years or so, what Forrester is predicting is that a large number of applications that have historically been distributed by enterprises are going to be distributed in a software as a service framework. What does that mean? Well, it means that your organizations are moving away from these very thick client-server based applications that have been, growing over the past 10 to 20 years, back since the 90s, that are doing line of business work. And a lot of organizations are saying the technical debt required to update and maintain and manage those applications is so large that most of the software they're looking at of purchasing in the new world is a software as a service model. They want to go to a website, they want to provision the application, and they want people to be able to access those sorts of apps through the internet. Now that means you've still got 75% of the software that is going to be a traditionally managed and maintained mode. But even 25% is a large amount for organizations that haven't exposed that in the past. Now the final number that I want to talk about is the ability for employees to get work done when they're not at their desk. And this is critical, because when you're talking about the types of individuals who are demanding bring your own device and choose your own device scenarios, these individuals are the ones who are working on the weekend. They're working at lunch. They're working after hours. They're maintaining a 50 or 60 or 70 hour more work week schedule. These are the ones who are really the rainmakers. They're the ones who are driving your organization to greater profitability and greater success. Because of that, these individuals are people that you really want to make sure are happy. You don't want them to be having any sort of issues getting into your environment, because quite frankly, these are the ones who are the most progressive and the ones who are bringing in the most new business. These are the individuals that feel special. They know they're working hard. They feel like they deserve a break. They feel like they shouldn't have to come into the office to send and receive emails. Or if there's a newer device that's out there, they want to be able to acquire that device and immediately show it off, not only for their own purposes, but also in front of potential customers and prospects. They want to be seen as that tip of the spear in many cases. So because of that, you want these individuals to be on your side, and bring your own device and choose your own device scenarios really enable you to do that. So if you look at the total landscape, frequently people will dive right into a mobile device management world or a rich application management world without thinking about how those different scenarios really play out. And this is something that we've had conversations with customers, and Microsoft has conversations with customers every single day about this. It helps to break down what the trends are, so that you can identify what the low-hanging fruit is for your organization before you go after a very large policy that carries with it a lot of risk. So when you think about the types of changes that are occurring, the first is obviously the sheer explosion of devices. It used to be 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, that individuals might come to work and have a single desktop or a single laptop that they use to consume their work content. Now, almost everyone has a smartphone. Almost everyone has a second or even third or fourth device that they're using on a regular basis. They've got a tablet at home, they've got a work desktop, they've got a phone that they use, they've got another tablet or another kiosk that they interact with. In total, people typically have an average of 4 to 5 devices, which is just a huge amount when you consider a few years ago they might have 1 or possibly 2. So the explosion of devices is something that's very obvious and in everyone's face when you're thinking about these challenges. But going beyond the device story are the application story, because a lot of individuals in these workplaces not only have access to a number of devices, but they're also accessing different apps on each of those devices. In the homogeneous world of 20 years ago or 10 years ago, you might have a Windows PC that had a bunch of 32-bit client applications on it. Now, I've got a phone that might be running iOS. I've got a tablet that might be running Android. I've got 3 different app stores that are leveraging all of those different platforms in addition to my traditional Windows environment. So even for the same type of service, I might have 3 different apps. I might have a Windows app, an iOS app, and an Android app. I might have a website that's doing a software as a service model, and I might have a thick client traditional 32-bit app. So 5 different apps all for the same underlying service that's going out there. So managing and maintaining those apps becomes critical in the world where everyone is running around with these different devices. Ultimately, I think the data is where organizations want to get. It's certainly great to secure individuals' devices and apps, but if you can't secure the data, if you can't prevent people from sharing sensitive data around your organization, then the fact that you've protected the device and the application almost becomes meaningless. Think about individuals who are running around saving corporate data on USB drives. That's not a device. It doesn't really interact with an application, but you need to be able to protect that type of content. If there is a sensitive PowerPoint document or Word document or PDF that should only go out to some people, or people should only be able to view it for a certain amount of time, that's really the holy grail from a risk management perspective. Because you can wipe devices and you can turn off people's access to apps, but unless you have a mechanism to restrict people's access to data, all of that other stuff is going to be meaningless. So when we think about where people came from in the past, traditionally, most IT shops began by managing laptops. It was pretty standard. They knew what the risks were. They knew what the cost and complexity was. It was a relatively low complexity environment. They used things like Windows Active Directory to manage identities, to maintain who could log into those devices. They use group policies to secure the devices themselves, put in place security and mitigation strategies in cases machines were damaged or lost or what have you. Even with laptops, if we think back 5 years before, 10 years before that, it was mostly desktops. But with the move to laptops, really the only danger was that people would be bringing these devices outside of the corporate firewall. So you wanted to make sure they had protection against viruses and malware. You wanted to make sure when they did come back into your environment that any health problems were rapidly mitigated and triaged, and that if there were issues with the devices themselves, that you would know about that as soon as they brought them back in or connected via a VPN. As the cost of these technology implementations came down, technologies like direct access allowed these laptops to be essentially always on the network. So you never had to worry, oh, if I'm going to some other network, because it would connect and phone back home, and you could see in real time what was the security status of these particular devices. So a relatively low amount of risk and a fairly predictable cost. You always knew how many laptops you had rolling around. You didn't have to worry, if someone was going to go out and hire 10 new people, how many devices they would have. They would have 10 laptops. It was a one-to-one relationship there. When you move to the device world, things got a little bit more complex. And this is honestly where we see a lot of organizations struggling today. There are a variety of different mobile device management solutions that are out there. The costs tend to be quite high. So when you think about a lot of the organizations that exist today, in the past, they might have corporate controlled devices, and those devices would be purchased and provisioned by the organization. That's great. People could choose a set standard. No, everyone was going to get that one device. The problem with that model is that people didn't like the devices. I remember 15 years ago being handed a Nextel phone or a BlackBerry and being told, this is your corporate phone, this is your corporate device that you have to use for corporate data and corporate connectivity. No one wanted those phones. And as a result, people went out and walked around with two phones all the time. They'd have one work phone and one personal phone. As many organizations have shifted and said, well, we don't want to be responsible for what happens when these devices are broken or lost or what have you. We'd rather push that onto the consumer at the very least because it's cheaper from a support perspective. That's when MDM solutions came into play. And a lot of the big MDM vendors that are out there have effectively still duplicated that old world of two phones on everyone's hips. You have one phone that's a personal phone, and then you have inside that phone a separate container that contains all the exact same apps, but for a work environment. You have a work email, you have a work contact list, you have a work set of productivity software. The net result is that people end up having two apps for exactly the same function, And the result is exactly the same as those old days of people being frustrated by having that different experience. People don't want to have a third-party contact management system or a third-party calendar system. They want to be able to use the first-party apps that have been developed by the large major players. When you think about the number of developers that Microsoft or Google or Apple have on staff, that dwarfs many of the developers that exist at these smaller MDM providers. And the result is clear. Staff at every organization almost always prefer the first-party apps that are developed by those three organizations to the smaller, more kludgy-looking apps that exist in these containerized models. Net result being that people don't enroll their device in MDM. And that's what you have to face when you talk about adoption, is that risk that people won't enroll their device. If you're preventing people from getting access to their email, that's a very big stick to encourage them to enroll their device. But a lot of organizations just throw up their hands and say, well, you can get it via ActiveSync, you can get it via web browser, we're just not going to bother. We'll have an MDM solution, but it's really going to be something that just provides us peace of mind that we have a solution rather than something that solves a discrete problem. And that goes back to that model of data protection. If all you're doing is protecting the devices, if you're encrypting every single phone that's enrolled in your MDM system, that's great. But if I get an email on my phone that contains a sensitive document and I can just forward that document off to my Outlook.com address or a Yahoo address or what have you, those documents aren't secure at all. And so even though the device is encrypted, if it's not preventing people from sharing sensitive data with others, effectively you've got a great way of wiping the device if it's lost, but it's not actively preventing people from sharing that information. That's where it moves to the SaaS app story. And most of the organizations that we speak to just haven't wrapped their hands around this. When you think about all the types of corporate data that exist in a traditional environment, and then all of these third-party software as a service solutions that are out there, things like Dropbox or OneDrive for consumers, even official corporate policies, things like Concur, DocuSign, or LinkedIn. There are lots of different avenues that people can use to move corporate data out of your very protected, secure environment into cloud services. And if you're not protecting that data, it can be difficult to manage it. Think about a consumer service like Twitter. We see a lot of organizations where there is a corporate Twitter account, multiple people have access to that Twitter account. If any of those individuals is fired or let go, because it's a shared identity, they can just log into the corporate Twitter account, post some inappropriate post on their way out the door, if not before. By having no true identity mechanism for governing these software as a service applications, you set yourself up for a large amount of risk tolerance. Because at the end of the day, whether it's Twitter or the consumer version of OneDrive or even an HR system like Concur, you really need to secure who can get access to it, and you need to secure the types of data they can move into it. If every individual at your organization can bring up their iPhone and choose to save a corporate document into iCloud, that's instantly setting yourself up for liability when that person leaves, because they'll still have access to all of those pieces of data. So most of the organizations that we talk to really haven't solved the software as a service application quandary. If marketing or the CFO or these other groups are going around IT and spinning up these third-party services, IT typically doesn't have the ability to even know that they're doing that, let alone secure identity and access to those applications, or know how much data is leaking out of the organization to those software as a service applications. If you were seeing gigabytes of data every day moving into some of these solutions, you'd be able to at least mitigate it and say, hey, let's stop doing this. Let's wrap our heads around what's going on here and how we can be more effective at securing the data inside our organization. So it's a high cost and a high risk environment, but most of the orgs that we see just don't know how to even start having that conversation. Finally, there's the Holy Grail, data itself. And this goes back to that idea of if I've got a document that can be emailed around or stored on a USB drive, and we've seen it time and time again someone will send an email after they realize that Outlook, suggested someone for them to email, and that person wasn't who they intended. They'll belatedly try and recall the message, even after it's gone out on the internet, with sensitive data. And nothing says, I've sent sensitive data to the wrong person more than, oh, there's a message recall, a few minutes after it's sent. And that just drives people to click on it and see what type of data you shared with them. Ultimately, there's not a good solution, or there hasn't been an easy solution for organizations to implement in the past, because the cost is quite high. You have to implement something that works for every type of data that you work with, every type of document, whether it's a PDF or a Word document or a PowerPoint. It has to be something that's always highly available, because as soon as you start to store data in these systems, you need to drive people to be able to consume them. And for most documents that we deal with on a regular basis, that means I need to use Excel the way I'm used to using it. But it also needs to be flexible. It needs to be something that if I'm on a plane or a train, that I could take offline for a certain amount of time. And so because of that, most of the solutions in the marketplace are quite expensive, not only to license, but also to implement. And that's what Microsoft really went out and said, look, we need to be able to deliver a solution that can implement this relatively quickly and solve those business problems that organizations have. Now, these are the ones that exist in your environment today. Most organizations probably are somewhere between the MDM solutions and the ID solution side of the coin, somewhere between that System Center and MDM solution side of the coin. Very few have gone all the way up. But that's just today. When you start to think about tomorrow and the next set of apps and the next set of challenges, how are you going to secure that? A lot of organizations went out and spun up very costly VDI solutions because they knew we're good at securing laptops. If we can force people into our VDI environment, we can still wrap our hands around it. And that works in some scenarios. In others, it's challenging. A lot of the applications that were built for VDI were never meant to run on a phone. The user interface just isn't there. They were never really meant to be something that was running on 5 different machines at once. And so those VDI implementations tend to be very complex and very expensive. They end up securing your environment, but they do force people to come back into the VDI sphere in order to be able to do it. We don't know down the road what the next area is that people are going to be looking to leverage to be able to store corporate data. And so as these technologies mature, you want a solution that's extensible that can hook into all of those future technologies that come down the road. So even though you may not be very far along this path, knowing that you have a solution that can go to the next level is critical to being able to implement it. So let's talk about Microsoft's solution. That's why we're here to talk about choose your own device and how you can deploy it. Microsoft has a solution called the Enterprise Mobility Suite that will actually track across all of these different use cases. It's focused very specifically on the end user. It wants to make sure that the person who is using these services is empowered, is able to use them, and wants to use them, as opposed to the previous solutions from other competitors that basically say, you've got a lot of risk, let's lock it down. Microsoft is saying the end user is ultimately going to be the arbiter of who adopts this technology. If we can make their life easier, they're going to adopt and use it. And that's what the Enterprise Mobility solution is designed around. So it's a very people-centric approach. It's focused on making sure the needs of IT are met as well as the end users. But it is something that is going to unify your entire environment around a series of discrete technologies. And that's the goal, to make this simple to deploy and easy for you to start taking advantage of it. So what does that look like? Well, there are 4 key pillars. And at most organizations, we tend to focus on the bottom 3 because they're ones that realistically light up the most use case scenarios at the most appropriate price point for them. So those are hybrid identity, mobile device and application management, access and information protection, and ultimately desktop virtualization. We've seen a lot of organizations that have done desktop virtualization in the past. It's a great technology. It allows you to leverage the existing investments you've made in Active Directory and group policies. For a lot of organizations, especially those on the smaller side, you're not going to be able to deploy a very large VDI environment simply because of cost. So we start by talking about items like hybrid identity and moving to mobile device and application management, and ultimately to protecting the data itself with access and information protection. And that is a spectrum. We almost always want to start with the hybrid identity side of the coin, because this is where you're going to really set the foundation for a bring your own device or choose your own device environment. So what is hybrid identity? So at the basics, hybrid identity is making sure that the existing investments you've made in Active Directory can be used for providing a single identity not only for applications and devices within your environment, but devices that are far outside of your environment and software as a service solutions that realistically are third-party products. How do you do that? Well, the first thing you need to reach for is single sign-on. You want to make sure when an individual logs into your environment, they're using an organizational ID that stretches across boundaries, across network boundaries, across rights boundaries, effectively making it easy for people to start consuming the services that they need to be able to light up the applications and data access that they're really used to. Now, when you think about where organizations are today with identity, frequently most organizations have one corporate identity and then a whole host of other identities that are floating out there. Think of the individual with a series of Post-it notes logging into different systems. Or for people who have 60 or 70 different systems, they may have a password management utility just to help them log into all these different services. It started in the consumer space. Many of us have 4 or 5 different banks we work with, or fitness trackers, or investment tracking mechanisms. All of those different websites contain a series of different logins. If you're following best security practices, you're going to have a different login for each, but that's more than anyone can remember. So almost everyone out there who has 30 or 40 or 50 different websites has some sort of management utility to allow them to do that. The problem is that ultimately people make mistakes, people reuse passwords, people don't practice good security, and if you think that you're only as vulnerable as your password policy is, you have to realize that a lot of people will reuse their corporate password for some of these consumer-based services, and that's a huge risk. If I'm using the same password for my Active Directory as I am for Netflix, then if my Netflix account gets compromised, potentially that person could log into your directory and start to do things as that individual. And that's a huge risk for you as an organization. So you really need to focus on two things. You want to have one single sign-on that allows a person to have access to all of the corporate resources that you need. You want to make sure that with that single sign-on, you have what's known as multi-factor authentication. So you don't want to be beholden to a user ID and a password, because that is an easily broken security mechanism. If you have multi-factor authentication, which is included with this scenario, you'll be able to use your phone, you'll be able to use a text message, a mobile application. There are a whole host of different mechanisms to allow you to secure that identity channel. And that's critical, because when you think about the channel that's enabling that service, it's not only for your Active Directory and access to your applications, it's also for those third-party websites. If I log into a Concur or a DocuSign or what have you, that website may not have multi-factor enabled for it. But as long as single sign-on is enabled in your environment and you're using what's known as Azure Active Directory, which is the core technology that powers this, as long as you're using Azure Active Directory, you'll be able to use that multi-factor to get into those alternate sites. Does this mean that you need to abandon your existing investments in Active Directory? Certainly not. You can set up a hybrid mode in which all of your existing identities inside Active Directory are simply duplicated in Azure Active Directory, and you're still making calls with the same username and password back to that service to make sure that people are safe and secure. In addition, because it's leveraging the power of Microsoft's cloud, you have some scenarios that you would never be able to turn on inside your on-premises environment. Think about your existing network. If an individual logged into your network from Washington, D.C., and then 30 minutes later logged in from New York City, that would be unusual. Most people don't have the ability to travel that fast between those two cities. But chances are your existing network infrastructure doesn't have the ability to detect that as an anomaly. It can't say, hey, this person logged into another environment and it's something that's too far for them to do. With Azure Active Directory and the Enterprise Mobility Suite, it will actually alert you and send a notification to you or your administrator saying, hey, this individual moved too fast. They're not capable of doing that. Even if it's not location-based from a timing perspective, it might be location-based from just a regular usage. If I do log in from New York and Boston and DC, but one week I show up in Atlanta, and that's unusual because I've never logged in from Atlanta, it's smart enough to say, this is unusual. You should take a look at it. Now, it's still leveraging the power of multi-factor authentication. It's still doing those security checks. But it's smart enough to say, hey, this is just outside the realm of where Reed normally logs in. Let's go ahead and check it out and flag an alert so that an administrator can give Reed a call and make sure that he's in Atlanta. If it sees something like 50 failed logins and the 51st it gets in, well, that sounds sketchy. It sounds like someone did a brute force attack and got my password, and it'll alert you for that. Even if you log in from an area of a network that's known to contain malware and spyware. If I visit my relatives and they have a malware-infested OS X machine and I log on from that machine, I'm protected in two specific ways with this hybrid identity model. The first way is that it'll tell me immediately that that device has been a device that has logged in from a malware-infested portion of the network. It'll say, hey, you're logging in from this location. This location is known for malware and spyware. It's going to send an alert to the administrator. But simultaneously, it's going to request that I use multi-factor authentication. So even though that OS X desktop that I log in, which might have two separate keyloggers installed on it, is grabbing my username and password, it's not able to grab my multi-factor code. And so even though they may have some information that I've typed in, they won't be able to authenticate as me. And when the operations team comes to me and says, hey, I noticed that you were logging in from this area which is known for malware or spyware, I'll be able to know that my device and my information is still secure. Maybe I'll have to change my password, but that doesn't mean that people have access to my content. They're still not able to get in as me because they don't have multi-factor enabled. So these are scenarios that right now, at most organizations, they just don't have the ability to do that. They can't protect people in their network that well. When that extends to third-party websites, it becomes even more important. When you think about these websites like a Concur or a DocuSign, in the past, I might have a whole series of identities just to get into that. But ultimately, I really just want to use that organizational ID to be able to log in. If I was logging into DocuSign, let's say in the past, if I went in to my, again, keylogger malware-infested machine outside of the network, if I logged in directly to DocuSign, it would take a username and a password. Any keylogger would be able to get that information. If instead of logging in directly to DocuSign, I choose to log in through our hybrid identity infrastructure, it's going to require MFA, and it's going to pass that credential through on the back end. So a keylogger won't be able to see the information. It'll instead be using multi-factor authentication. So it enables me to light up a large number of scenarios that in the past would never be possible. I can secure almost any web application that I have access to through this mechanism to provide access to the individuals at my organization, which means when they leave, all I have to do is what I've always done. Just deactivate their Active Directory account, and they'll immediately be unable to log into these third-party websites. They never knew the passwords to get in the first place. They were exclusively using their organizational ID as part of our environment to log in and get into those SaaS applications. It's an incredibly powerful story and something you can't do if you're just running on-premises Active Directory today. The final component, that's probably one of the most important ones, is when you start to think about choose your own device, you really want people to be going out and buying devices on their own that they're choosing to bring to work. But you want to make sure that those devices are secure. And so with hybrid identity, you can set up what's known as conditional access. And the way that works is when I get a new device that I've chosen to purchase, when I try to log into my email for the first time, I'm not outright denied. It's not telling me, hey, you got to give this to IT to be able to enroll it. Instead, it sends me a very nice message that says, hey, in order to get this device enrolled with your email, enrolled with your OneDrive for Business, you have to accept these policies. Once you accept the policies, we'll push a small agent down to your device. It's not going to inventory your personal software. It's not going to look at the apps that you have already on the device. It's going to enable some new apps to be installed, and it's going to manage those apps in a seamless way such that if you ever change your security policy, if you require people to have a PIN, for instance, or you turn off their camera, if I figure a way around those controls, if I jailbreak the device, let's say, it will instantly be invalid from a conditional access perspective, and it'll pull all of that corporate data off without me even having to think about it. If I'm merely not up to date on my patches, for instance, it might remove access if I had set that as a requirement, such that I can't get access until I'm fully patched and healthy and compliant. All of that conditional access goes back to identity. You can't really deploy a robust solution until you set up the identity to allow you to do that. And that's honestly where we work with most of the organizations. Almost every organization we work with has not yet deployed an identity management solution that is as robust as the one included with the Enterprise Mobility Suite. So it's the very first area that we want people to start working on. Let's say that you set that up. What does that actually look like? Well, when I log into my machine, I'm going to have to provide an identity. If I have a series of cloud services that are out there that I'm having to remember, what am I going to do? Well, let's say IT provisions a new app for me to access, or a new website that I need to be able to get access to. In the new model, every single one of those apps is going to be synchronized to my single account using my identity to get into them. I'm not going to have to think about it. Even simple scenarios such as me forgetting my password. In the past, that would have had to have gone to the IT support team to reset it. Now I have a self-service password option that will dramatically reduce the cost of implementation, because if I forget it, I can go in there myself and reset my password without any IT being required, using the security questions I set up. If I go out and purchase a new device, I choose to enroll that, it'll pull the policy that IT has chosen for me, and it'll also, in addition to pulling that security policy, automatically push out the applications that I want to my individuals at my organization. So I don't even have to think about that. If I've got a malicious actor who's trying to get in, the fact that I have the ability to block it based not only on passwords, but also the ability to alert when people are trying to come in from alternate vectors, different locations, that's automatically alerting to my IT team that I can know that. So all of the organizations that we start with a mobile device policy, we almost always begin with the hybrid identity story, because this is going to be the thing that allows you to do a lot more once you begin deploying those mobile devices or trying to manage those mobile devices. So what does the actual mobile device policy look like with the Enterprise Mobility Suite? Well, it's through a tool called Microsoft Intune. It's a single pane of glass that lets you manage all of the devices in your organization. In addition to managing mobile devices like phones, it even allows you to manage desktops and laptops as well. So it's a single pane of glass to cover all the types of devices inside your environment. What does that look like? Well, if I've got a device, we already walked through what that scenario was when I went out and purchased a device. In this case, Intune segments between corporate controlled devices and personal devices. So for corporate controlled devices, Intune will do a full inventory of everything that's on there. You'll know every application, you'll know every single bit of data that's on it. For personal owned devices, though, I don't really want to scare people off. I don't want to tell them that it's going to go in and inventory all the apps and data that they have. I really want to make it as seamless as possible. I want them to be able to self-service those devices and enroll them. And if they ever leave or depart, I want the corporate data to be pulled off, but I don't want to have to do a full wipe, such as in the old ActiveSync days, to enable that functionality. What does that look like? Well, if I've got a new device, I log into the company portal and it will enroll the device. Now there's a company portal app for iOS, for Android, for Windows. It's a consistent user interface and user design. So if I have 5 different types of applications, I will be able to understand all 5 of them without having to learn a new design language for it. As soon as I enroll that device, it will start to give me access to recommended applications that the organization has suggested that I consume. I can choose to publish those if I want to. It'll also simultaneously pull down the policy from IT to make sure that my device is secure and meets those conditional goals. So one of those might be to encrypt the device or to require a PIN on the device. As long as I'm enrolled, I'm going to have to get those corporate policies pushed to me to meet the need. So it can let you be very confident that any device that's consuming corporate data will be able to meet the security standards that you set as an organization. If there is a loss of the device, let's say that I leave my device in a cab or I leave it on a bench somewhere, I don't have to go to IT to wipe the phone. I can just go to my company portal from any device, or even the web. If I'm not on one of the managed devices, I can just go to the website and choose to wipe the corporate data from that phone, or choose to wipe the phone entirely. And when you think of the scenarios that are out there, if I damage the device in some way, I'm not going to have to worry that someone's going to get on it. But if I just leave it somewhere, it might be something where I say, you know what, let's just wipe the corporate data and be done with it. I don't have any personal data that's on there. If I was reselling my phone to someone else, maybe I'd just wipe the corporate data. I don't care about anything else that's on there. If it's something where it legitimately is lost and I don't know where it is, I might choose to wipe the whole device and pull it. But I don't need to go to IT to do that. I can self-service that all on my own. And once I choose to do that, if I choose to wipe the corporate data, it'll just wipe that corporate data off, and I'll be able to resume using the phone as I was. So because it extends across all of those different platforms, there really isn't a whole lot that the staff who consume this need to know. Once you've got your identity in place, being able to manage those devices is really pretty simple. You want to make sure you can wipe it. You want to make sure you can set up conditional access to your applications. But there's not a lot beyond that that you need to do to begin using it. So most of the organizations that we work with, I would say a larger percentage of their time is getting the identity squared away. Once that's squared away, deploying a mobile device management policy to all of their devices is quite easy. And what you're going to see over the next 6 months, especially once Windows 10 is released, is the concept of mobile device management is really going to extend beyond the phone and tablet form factors to desktop and laptops. So starting with Windows 8.1 and moving forward to Windows 10, Microsoft has built into the operating system of Windows hooks for mobile device management to give you much of the control and granular ability of group policy, but in a mobile device management world. What does that mean? It means regardless of whether you're using a phone or a tablet or even a desktop, you'll be able to use Intune to provide rich controls around security, firewall settings, port access, hardware capabilities. All the things that you would want to be able to control in your environment are going to be surfaced in Intune, such that individuals don't have to think, am I on a desktop or a laptop, and therefore have a different experience than if they're on their phone or their tablet. All of those will seamlessly work across the board and include additional features and functionality such as rich user identities, the lack of the need for passwords, the ability to use biometrics, for instance, and of course the ability for encryption and real-time security on the devices. So typically most of the organizations that we talk to start with identity and then move to mobile device management. We've worked with a lot in the past that started in really the opposite direction. because they were familiar with laptops, they went out and purchased a mobile device management solution, or they purchased a VDI implementation. And the danger there is, if you haven't secured your identity, being able to secure the devices doesn't get you very far. If I'm going to log into a third-party software as a service website and start to push data into that website, the fact that my phone is encrypted doesn't help me at all, because even if I lose the phone, that data has already been lost to that other website. So when we talk about risk and building a heat map for what the most common risk scenarios are, we want to be very clear that identity is the first workload to move, and mobile device management is typically the second workload to turn on. Because if you haven't protected those identities, being able to have a bunch of encrypted devices doesn't get you very far. But let's say you've done it through the right process. You've secured your identity, you protected your mobile devices. Great. You don't have to worry that someone is logging into a website that you don't know about. You don't have to worry about your devices being encrypted. Does this solve all your problems? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. There's still a very common scenario, regardless of whether you secured people's access to certain sites or devices, that comes up time and time again. And that problem is access to the data itself. Ultimately, people are building data into every single app that they work with. This could be an email that's a very sensitive email. It could be a PowerPoint deck or a PDF or a Word document, regardless of what form the information takes. And this may only be 1 to 5% of the documents or emails that you work on a regular basis. In the past, it's been cost prohibitive for organizations to secure that type of data. Primarily not because of the software licensing costs. Microsoft actually had a solution in the market 10 years ago that did this. But the big cost had been around the implementation of it. I remember having a conversation 10 years ago with a customer around what was known as Active Directory Rights Management Service. What did AD RMS do? Rather, it allowed people to secure very granular controls into their data. When you think about an organization that has a sensitive Word document, for instance, RMS allowed you to go into that document and say very specifically who could access it and how long they could access it and what people could even do with that access. Maybe they couldn't print the document. Maybe they couldn't send it to someone else. RMS was truly ahead of its time, and the cost was quite low from a software licensing perspective. The gap was that whenever organizations decided to stand up RMS, they inevitably asked, well, what happens if our RMS server goes down? Or how long do we need to be running this RMS service? Is it something we could run for a year and turn off? And the answer was, because these documents were encrypted, the moment that you moved them into RMS, those servers could never go down. They had to be running 24/7. You couldn't be patching them for any length of time, because if you ended up taking those servers offline, no one would be able to access the documents that you had protected with them. Consequently, building out a highly available clustered environment that spanned geographies tended to be very complex and tended to be quite expensive. And so we saw that implementations of raw rights management server tended to be quite low, even though the software costs were negligible. Enter Azure Rights Management Service. So as part of the Enterprise Mobility Suite, you get access to that level of control and granularity with the files that you're working on. The difference is, instead of you having to stand up your servers or pay an organization like New Signature to do that, you can actually immediately take access to Microsoft's cloud service called Azure Rights Management Service to allow you to get in there and begin turning on those capabilities from the get-go. What does that look like? Well, let me show you. So in a traditional environment, I've got a series of apps that I access regularly that contain sensitive corporate information. Those apps have access to data, tables, charts, what have you. Now, IT, ultimately, their job is to protect access to that data. And in the past, what they might do is use very granular controls on a file system to say, well, you can't get access to this document unless you have rights to that specific document. They didn't have a whole lot of control beyond that, though, because once you were an owner of that document, you really could send that to anyone. Now, as an end user, if I want to consume that information on a particular device, you could certainly choose to block that using the mobile device management strategies that we talked about in the past. But let's say that I have a device that I want to start working with on the road. I've got a personal laptop. I want to be able to get access to that corporate content. What do? Well, in the past, I might email myself a copy of the document. Great, now I've got a copy of the document. The negative there is I'm on an insecure device, and I could email that copy to anyone under the sun. There's no limitation for what I need to do. When you look with Azure Rights Management Service, instead of having access to a document and emailing it to myself, I'm going to actually grab that document from a secure location. That could be OneDrive for Business, that could be a SharePoint site, that could be any number of different locations. When I'm grabbing the document from that location, it's going to set very specific rights on what I can do with that particular document. So for instance, it might make it read-only. It might prevent me from printing it. It might prevent me from forwarding that email message to other individuals. So because I have access to that document, it's going to make those granular controls occur every time I open it. So as soon as I open the document, it's going to ask for my identity. I'm going to credential into the document, and that's going to mean that I have access to it. If I try to access it on a different device, if I try to use incorrect identity to get in, that's going to prevent me from accessing it. What's a use case scenario for that? Well, let's imagine that you're working on a document that you want people to see for the next 7 days. But after 7 days, you want to pull it back. You can build a time bomb capability into the document and tag it and say, for the next 7 days, all of these individuals can look at this particular document. But after 7 days, I'm going to pull it back so that they no longer have access to that document. You can build that into the service itself and tag anything that needs to be tagged with that 7-day expiration immediately. How does this help you from a risk perspective? Well, when you think about devices that people aren't managed, or even just data in general, if I tag every piece of document that I work on that's sensitive with a 7-day time bomb, if I lose my device, if I email someone those documents, after 7 days, they no longer have access to the document. So I don't have to worry that I've got access to the entire history of every document I've ever worked on. It realistically is limiting it to the last 7 days of the documents that I've done. And because that's tied to my identity, if a malicious user or an inadvertent user opens up that Word document or PowerPoint or PDF, they're going to immediately be asked for their credentials, and Office isn't going to let them in until they put in the proper credentials for access. So it makes it very easy to ensure that even if you inadvertently send a Word document to someone you didn't intend, they're not going to be able to open it up and read it. It's going to be encrypted from the get-go, and they'll have to credential in with the proper identity before they could ever access it. So this is, in many ways, the holy grail of information protection. When you think about the types of documents that are out there, even if this is only 1% or 5% of the documents that you work with on a regular basis, chances are those documents that need to be secure are the most risky documents that are out there. And most of the risk is honestly inadvertent. It's not that you're trying to protect against some sort of nefarious hacker that's out there coming into your organization. Most of the time, you're trying to prevent individuals from your organization from just making silly mistakes. You know, they forward a document to someone outside the org that they shouldn't have. It's very easy to set up an RMS policy that says this document or this email should only remain inside the organization. If Outlook has an autocomplete and tries to send it to a personal address outside of my org, it just prevents you from doing that. Simple things like replying all you can prevent with this mechanism. If I'm trying to print something that's sensitive, I'm not trying to be malicious, I just wanted to print the document. But by instituting that policy inside the document itself, it ensures that you don't get people doing bad security practices in your environment. Ultimately, you know, even with Rights Management Service, it's not a panacea. It's not going to protect every scenario. I could always take a camera out of my pocket and take a picture of that document. So you need to be sensitive about who you're sending the information to. But for common use case scenarios, this is going to dramatically protect you in a way that you never could previously. So it's a big win for most of the organizations that we work with to making sure that they're able to start using their documents the way that they want to. All of this is part of the Enterprise Mobility Suite, that identity, consolidation and control, the ability to protect devices, and ultimately to protect the data itself is all included in the Enterprise Mobility Suite. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to reach out to New Signature or your Microsoft account rep to talk about how we could start a project with you today to get you on a better footing when it comes to choosing your own device and mobile device management. Questions?
Reed, I don't see anything in the chat window, but I will go ahead and unmute the audience in case anyone wants to ask a question over the line.
We're happy to, of course, answer questions afterwards as well. My information is contained within the presentation, and all of us at New Signature. We've actually been a mobile device management partner since Microsoft built this software several years ago. We're Microsoft's Intune Partner of the Year of all time, really. So if you have any follow-up questions on Intune or the Enterprise Mobility Suite as a group, we'll be happy to answer them afterward as well.
Alrighty, great. Well, I will go ahead and stop recording the meeting. If nobody has any questions, just like Reed said, please feel free to follow up with us at any time. I am going to drop an email address into the chat window right now, info@newsignature, and we will always be able to direct you in the appropriate direction. Any follow-up questions you may have, you want to keep talking about Enterprise Mobility Suite, you want to talk about something completely different, if you notice any users or employees are logging in from different continents every 10 minutes, as Reed was talking about before, you should probably give us a call. Again, we'll post this webinar up to the website either later today or first thing tomorrow morning so that you can go back and re-watch any of this content, share with any colleagues, what have you. With that being said, if there are no last-minute questions, thanks again, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Reed, and we look forward to seeing you guys at our next webinar. Take care, everybody.